Okay, well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on when you're listening to this, Year 12. Here goes my second attempt at this video. And the first one, I got almost to the end and discovered that it didn't seem to like the recording. So, better luck this time, hopefully. So, this is just to try and help you double check you've got your diagrams right for solutions to demerit goods and negative externalities. So, just to remember, we are trying to solve the things that are worse for people than they realise, or the things that people consume, use, produce that have negative effects on third parties. So solution number one, we did quite a lot on tax, and your 25 marker is on it. Solution number two was regulation and legislation. And I said that you would need you would need two diagrams to show the effects of this solution. So the reason for two diagrams is because depending on what the legislation is, the law that's put into place, the solution may affect the producer or it may affect the consumer. So if we take a little look at what it would look like if we are going to affect the producer, normal market diagram. Now, something that might affect the producer might be a producer of tobacco, because of course if you introduce legislation, like there is, that says that all packets of cigarettes, for example, have to have standardised packaging and a pretty horrible picture of what happens to you if you consume tobacco, smoking kills thing message on it, and also you're not allowed to brand those cigarettes in any way, so you have to change your packaging as a result of that. That is a cost that will be incurred by the business. An increased cost, as we know, shifts the supply curve to the left, which takes us to a new equilibrium where the price being charged is higher at P1. The quantity being consumed will therefore be lower at Q1. So in some ways having an effect and causing the kind of reaction that you would hope for with a piece of legislation that you bring in. So that's one piece of legislation. So that could be about packaging, something that's going to cause that cost for the supplier. The other way that you might get an impact from legislation is because it might be something that actually has an impact on the consumer. So if we take quantity of alcohol that's being consumed, because of course there are age restrictions on who can buy alcohol at what ages. And this then affects the demand for alcohol, causes a shift inwards, because the effective demand, the demand of what people can actually buy, is reduced because anybody under the age of 18 is not allowed to purchase alcohol themselves. So that again also gets the sort of desired result, that reduction in the quantity that is going to be consumed. So hopefully your diagrams look the same as that. Those are the diagrams for solution number two. If we look now at what the diagrams are like for solution number three, then for solution number three, we are on to price controls. Now for price controls, I asked you to look at the impact of a minimum price for alcohol using Scotland as a good example, because that's somewhere that fairly recently has had that minimum price for alcohol introduced, so there's lots of newspaper articles about it. And also with those articles, there are reasons why they are trying that solution, because Scotland in particular has an issue with excessive alcohol consumption, alcohol-related disease and alcohol-related death, hence them searching for that solution. It's taken them quite a long time to get that solution into place because the European Union was not happy with it. They said it was anti-competitive, and it took about 5 years of fighting through the EU courts before the Scottish Government has been allowed to put this into place. Now, obviously time will tell when we look at the outcome from Scotland in terms of evaluation whether this has actually worked, but we know what we think will happen and the reason why a minimum price is suggested. So, if we think about our market for alcohol in Scotland, now, what matters here is which kind of alcohol are we talking about. So the way it works in Scotland is that there is a minimum price of 50p per unit of alcohol. So if you have a drink and that drink has only got 1 unit of alcohol in it, then it must be charged out at least 50p. So that's going to affect the cheaper alcohol, not the expensive alcohol. To give you some sort of idea, a bottle of wine has about anywhere between 10 and 12 units of alcohol in it. So if it's got 10 units of alcohol, the minimum price for that bottle of wine, I'm sure you're all good mathematicians, will be £5. So if we give an example here of cheap alcohol, so I'm going to go lager, that's a pretty cheap alcohol. If you bring along a minimum price of this 50p, it is going to be bigger, higher than the current price of that alcohol in the marketplace. And then we can see that higher price, so we can't charge P, no business can charge just P because that would be illegal, it is below the minimum, so they have to charge more than that. And that causes what we call disequilibrium, because here's the quantity that businesses would really quite like to supply at that higher price. But consumers obviously don't want to buy as much at that higher price because it's now more expensive for them. So the difference between the amount being produced and the amount being consumed would be called a surplus. Now, normally in a marketplace, with that surplus, what you would do is you would reduce the price until you got to the equilibrium and you'd sell off your stock. Can't do that here because you have to charge at least this minimum price. So, what might happen in terms of will this work? Yes, it might work because businesses might decide that they will actually switch their production. Rather than producing this kind of alcohol, which is cheap, they may well move to produce less of this, so each and every price, shift their supply curve inwards, and switch their production, so maybe put some of their efforts, their factors of production, into making more expensive alcohol. What will also affect how much impact it has is obviously the elasticity of demand for that kind of alcohol, because the more inelastic it is, which often it is for alcohol, the smaller the effect there will be on the quantity that's actually going to be bought by people. But this is a diagram that does show you how it might have an impact on a marketplace for cheap alcohol. Now, if we take some of our more expensive alcohol, I don't know, quantity of brandy maybe, what will it do there? Well, here we go. Here's our demand curve, here's a supply curve. Now, in this marketplace, this is quite expensive alcohol. It's already being charged at quite an expensive price. So will it make any difference? No, it won't. Because you bring in this minimum price, this 50p per unit of alcohol, and it's below the current equilibrium. So this is the price that customers are being charged, nicely above that minimum price in the marketplace. So it makes absolutely no difference to those more expensive producers. So when we're trying to evaluate the effectiveness of a minimum price, clearly it depends quite a lot on elasticity of demand and also what kind of alcohol it is you're actually buying. So that helps you hopefully with some of the evaluation aspects for that one. Now, the reason why I asked you to look at the minimum price for alcohol, not only because it's fairly recent and there's lots of stuff about it, is because the other common example, which is the one in your textbook, is the national minimum wage. Now, you do need to know about that, but we will cover the national minimum wage quite a bit, or in detail, when we look at labour markets next year. So we will come back to that, so if you've got any questions on minimum wage, that will hopefully become clearer then. So, fourth solution. This is a nice straightforward diagram, really. Because what happens with the fourth solution, which is advertising and communication, education and awareness, is you are hopefully, well, let's stick with alcohol here, you're hopefully going to inform, educate, advertise so that people change their mind about how much they want to consume. So that will definitely, of course, affect the demand curve. The intention is to make it so that the number of people who want to buy alcohol at each and every price is reduced. And if you think about some of the education that you may have had through PSHE in school, some of the adverts that exist about drink driving, some of the adverts and information you get in health centres and doctors' surgeries advising you on how it affects you and so on, you can see that the intention of that information is to cause everybody to want to purchase less of it at each and every price. Now, there are lots of reasons why people say this is a really good solution. Because if you get people to make the decision for themselves, they perhaps are much more likely to stick to it, and for the right reasons. They are choosing healthier options for themselves, which can be very true. And a lot of people believe that if you can, get people to believe that message when they're younger, so through education or whilst they're at school, they then are set up in a healthier pattern for their lives. The difficulty is, of course, it takes you quite a long time to know whether it's actually worked or not. And so therefore, that limits your knowledge as to whether it's truly worked at all, or whether something else has caused a change in the demand for that good. And there is this thing called the teenager effect, which I'm sure none of you would ever be guilty of. But the teenager effect, of course, is that when you tell a load of teenagers why something's a really bad idea or something they really shouldn't do, that's exactly what they then want to go and do. So again, depending on what it is, does depend, and how it's conveyed to people does depend on how effective the solution of information, awareness, advertising and communication is. So when you're sort of making an evaluation about the effectiveness of that, a lot's going to depend on the actual specific situation you are judging. Now, the fifth solution that I asked you to look at was the use of pollution permits, which is also known as carbon trading. And my apologies if I didn't make that clear in the email. So this is an EU scheme, so all the countries in the European Union abide by this scheme, and they have to trade their carbon in order to be able to emit carbon. So businesses are given a permit, an allowance, by each government. So the EU amount is divided up into the EU countries, and then the government divides it up amongst the businesses that emit CO2 emissions. It's a really good idea because it means that if you are a really green producer, you don't need all the permits that you are given, so you can sell them to somebody else and some revenue. If you are a dirty polluter, you're not a very clean or green company, you need to buy those permits. So the idea is, by having to buy them, life is more expensive for you, and you may well then be tempted to invest in green technology. And if you're kind of middle of the road, you use your permits but you have no spare, then you're okay. Now, the difficulty comes in getting the amount of permits issued correct. And that's where the EU scheme has struggled somewhat. The intention, if you imagine you've got a supply, say for 2018 of permits, and then you make that supply a little smaller for 2019, and so on, is that over time, the price that those permits would be charged at gets higher and higher, and therefore it becomes more and more expensive to be a dirty company, and there is more and more incentive to clean up your act and sort out what you're doing. The intention is good. It has problems happening in its execution. There's been difficulties with fraudulent trading. And as soon as there is a drop in demand, pretty much like there is at the moment, because there's an awful lot of factories around the world that aren't producing diddly squat, that demand shifts down substantially, and suddenly the price of those permits is really low. And as soon as the price is low, there is very little incentive for any slightly dirty company or big polluter to clean up their act. You'll notice that I've put quantity of permits here. It's not quantity of pollution. Nobody's buying pollution. They're buying a permit that allows them to emit a certain amount of CO2 emissions. So just be careful with that. So you could have a diagram that shows that, and that would be perfectly okay for this particular market. You could have one where people are selling their permits, because those permits that are on here are issued by the government. That's why there's a fixed supply. That's what fixed supply is about. Here, this could be the businesses who've got spare permits to sell and the demand for them. And of course, as you clean up your act, there are more and more of them being supplied. So that does then, of course, cause the price to lower, which makes the scheme slightly less effective. The tricky thing is that clearly this is a scheme that operates currently within the European Union. The Paris Accord, which is the latest climate change international discussion that took place, that with any kind of agreement, is trying to get more countries around the world to sign up to some sort of carbon trading scheme like this. However, that's hugely difficult to get other places to agree to. Particularly when you've got the fact that Mr. Trump, I'm afraid, withdrew. America, who is the world's second biggest emitter of CO2, withdrew from the Paris Accord and said he wasn't playing with that policy anymore, and he didn't agree with it. So that then does limit how much impact that's all going to have if some of the world's biggest polluters aren't joining in to try and make that happen. Anyway, I hope that has been useful. Please let me know.